So welcome back, everybody. First of all, I just want you to tell you that we're going to be doing a mimer, a discourse. It's not overly long, so hopefully we'll be able to cover it over the next few weeks. But before we can even begin, before we can dip our toes into the waters of this mimer, there are some basic spiritual principles that we're going to have to review, because without that information, it will be quite difficult for us to understand what's going on in this particular mimer, in this particular discourse. So let's start at the beginning. We're going to learn a whole lot of terminology. Okay, that's how we're going to start. We're going to start with a whole lot of terminology. The first terms that we're going to learn, and you'll notice that the terms we're going to learn are mostly in pairs. So the first terms that we're going to learn are the expressions ma and ban. Okay, that's the first thing we're going to learn. Ma and ban. So effectively what that actually means is these are abbreviated words. So you would write it as follows. You'd write ma is mem, abbreviated hey, and ban is beis, abbreviated, and then nun. So it obviously stands for something, right? If you've got an abbreviation like that, it obviously stands for something. So usually, when you have an abbreviated word in Hebrew, usually you expect that each letter in the abbreviation will represent a word. That's not exactly the case in this particular context. In fact, in this particular context, ma and ban are actually expressions of different manifestations of Hashem's name. So let's quickly understand what that means. We know that everything in Torah, every letter in the Hebrew language, has a numerical value. So if I had to take the numbers mem and hey, the letters mem and hey, that would give me a numerical value of 45. So when we talk about ma, we're talking about something not so much that is associated with the letters, but more with the number 45. When we take ban, beis and nun, has a numerical value of 52. So that's our first clue as to what these two spiritual terms are. Okay, so ma is somehow associated with 45, and ban is somehow associated with 52. Now these two terms are going to be pivotal to our understanding of whatever it is that we're going to learn together, because we're consistently going to move back and forth between the two realities of ma and ban. Okay, so the first clue that you have is the numerical value. Ma equals 45 and ban equals 52. Once you play gematria, which means once you start to look at the numerical values of words, you'll discover that what also has a numerical value of 45 is the word Adam, which is the human being. And not just the human being, but Adam actually represents a human being at our most developed. We could refer to a human being as Enosh. Ma Enosh kisis kereno, as it says in Tehillim. Enosh implies a human being in their least developed state. Then if a person works on themselves and tries to improve themselves, we call that person gever. Gever from the word gevura. They've got the strength, they've got the push, they've got the focus to try and change themselves. So a gever is more complimentary than the term enosh. If that person succeeds to some extent, if they succeed in elevating themselves and improving their character, then we'll call that person ish. And a person who has achieved absolute self-mastery, that's who we call Adam. So the fact that the word ma, or the expression ma, has the same numerical value as the term Adam, that is already a clue that we're talking about something which is of an elevated, an advanced spiritual level. So whatever ma is going to translate as, you can expect that it is the higher dimension of whatever it is that we're going to speak about. Now, in the same way as we took the number 45, and we said that 45 represents Adam, as it represents ma, we're going to take the number 52, and we're going to see that the number 52 has a numerical value of behema. Okay? Behema. What's a behema? A behema is an animal. So obviously, if we're talking about ma as representing Adam, which is not just human, but a human who has achieved self-mastery, So Ma obviously must refer to a very lofty spiritual level, whereas Ban, which is represented by Behema, which is an animal is obviously not very developed, must represent a much lower spiritual reality. In fact, we know the verse that says, Adam uvehema toshia Hashem, that there's this concept of Hashem bringing salvation to Adam and to Behema. Now, there are various ways that we can translate this. One of the ways is that Adam and Behema represent two kinds of spiritual beings. So Adam is the person who's achieved absolute self-mastery, and Behema would be the person who hasn't begun to even identify that there's such a thing as self-mastery. But for the purposes of our conversation, we're not talking in soul levels. Instead, we're talking levels of divine manifestation. So for the purposes of our conversation, we're going to consistently refer to Ma as a higher type of divine revelation and Ban as a lower kind of divine revelation. Okay, so that's a huge clue as to what we're going to be talking about in this discourse. Okay, let's understand this a little bit better. If I had to take, if I had to take Hashem's name, right? Obviously Hashem's name is critical to anything that we want to understand about godliness. So if I take Hashem's name, we all know that you spell Hashem's name Yud K Vav K. That's how you spell the ultimate name of Hashem. Yes, Hashem has other names as well, but this is the name of God that is, so to speak, the ultimate name of God. Yud, Hey, and Vav, Hey. So if I take that name of God, like any other word or any other expression in the whole of Hebrew, I can actually expand the word out. What do you mean I can expand the word out? Okay, again, we don't pronounce Hashem's name, right? We only pronounce the letters, and even then we disguise the Hay's because we don't want to make it sound like we're pronouncing Hashem's name. So we actually say Yud, K. We don't even want to say the name Hay. So when I say Yud, to be able to say Yud, I'm not just pronouncing that letter, I'm pronouncing other hidden letters that help me pronounce the word. In other words, if I took this word Yud and I expanded it to its full extent, that's how you would spell it. Yud, Vav, Dalet. That's how you spell the word Yud. So if I'm now looking at the gematria value, so I've now got the gematria value of 20 because this Yud has in it the letter Yud, which is worth 10, the letter Vav, which is worth 6, and the letter Dalet, which is worth 4. So I've now got the number 20 embedded inside the first letter of Hashem's name. So if I want to get the full expansion of the value of Hashem's name in gematria terms, I'm going to expand out all of the letters. Let's go back. If I just have Yud and Hey and Vav and Hey, then the Yud has a value of 10. Each of the Heys has a value of 5 each. That's another 10, making 20. And the Vav has a value of 6. So the numerical value of Hashem's name as it appears, Yud K, Vav K, is 26. But once I start to expand things out, then I'm going to come up with all different totals. So for example, now I've got 20 plus, right, because Yud, Vav, Dalet equals 20, plus the 2 Heys, so now I'm up to 30, plus the Vav is 36. The way that name is expanded out now, Yud spelled out Hey, Vav, Hey, will give me a numerical value of 36. The question is this: if I want to expand the name out fully, then I also have to spell out Hey, and I have to spell out Vav, and I have to spell out Hey again. The question is, how do you spell Hey? Is Hey supposed to be spelled Hey Aleph? Is Hey supposed to be spelled Hey Hey? Or is Hey supposed to be spelled Hey Yud? Likewise with Vav. Is Vav supposed to be spelled Vav Vav? Or is Vav supposed to be spelled Vav Yud Vav? So now, depending on which way I spell it out, the total that I'm going to get is going to be different. See how this works? So if I spell out the Yud Hey Vav Hey, and I spell the Heys as Hey Aleph, so now let's make this a little bit less confusing. So I've got Yud Vav Dalet, that's 20, plus Hey Aleph is now 26, plus Hey Aleph, that's another 6, is now 32. Okay? So now if I do Vav Aleph Vav, if I spell it that way, this is going to give me a total of 45. See what's happening here? When we talk about the term Ma, it's one of the configurations of how God's name spells out. If I do a different configuration, then it's going to spell out to 52, which is Ban. So, without getting overly technical, I know sometimes people talk about the fact that God has a 72-letter name. There is no 72-letter name. But if I spelled all of these with yuds, it would give me a numerical value of 72. So that's how God's name, Yud Kei Vav Kei, spreads out and manifests out into a number represented by 72, which we're not talking about in this particular conversation. What is relevant to our conversation is that we are going to be analyzing two different manifestations of God's name. One is the manifestation called Ma, and the other is the manifestation called Ban. So throughout this discourse, we will consistently refer to Ma and Ban, two different energies of divine expression. So if we're going to keep referring to them, it only makes sense for us to try and get a little bit of an understanding. What are the two? What does Ma mean and what does Ban mean? So we already identified that Ma has the numerical value of Adam, and Adam represents mastery. In other words, somebody who has climbed the highest spiritual rungs. And Ban has the numerical value of Behema, which is something quite untamed and undeveloped. So therefore we can conclude that anytime we talk about the name Ma, we're actually talking about a divine manifestation that comes from a higher realm and seeps into this world. So it comes from a developed space, and then it projects that developed insight into our world. Whereas the name Ban, that would refer to how Hashem, so to speak, manifests himself in the turmoil and challenges of our world. Or to put it into different words, Ma is shining a light of realization into earth. Ban is the experience of living on earth and trying to fix the world and make it a better place. And that's why it's a behema. Out of the different types of animals that exist, you get two classes. You get the kind of animal called a behema and the kind of animal called a chaya. We anticipate that it is possible to tame a behema. We don't anticipate that it's possible to tame a chaya. So Ban, which represents this animal, so to speak, energy, means a part of the world that we're looking to tame. We're looking to evolve. We're looking to uplift. That's what we're trying to achieve. So that's the first pair of words that we have to know in order to understand what's going on in this mimer. For the purpose of our conversation, Ma will always represent that which comes from Hashem into our space to inspire and uplift us. Ban will represent what we try to uncover about God in our world through our challenges and efforts. The second two terms that we have to be familiar with are these terms, Mad and Man. So again, these are also obviously not literal. They're, in this case, abbreviations. And they represent two kinds of water. You'll remember when we learned the story of creation, we learned that on the second day of creation, Hashem split between the higher waters and the lower waters. And ever since that second day of creation, there's always some tension of the higher and low waters trying to reconnect themselves. So on the face of it, the higher waters are what later became known as heaven, Shamayim. As Rashi says, Shamayim stands for Sham Mayim. There is some kind of water reality that exists there in that place in heaven. And then we have Mayim as we know it, water down here on this earth. So at face value, that was the division between a spiritual kind of water and a physical kind of water. And they both look to reconnect because once upon a time they were part of the same reality. And the nature of anything is to go back to its source. As the Gemara says, Zroik chutra le'avira ha'ikra koi. If you throw a stick in the air, it will always come down and land on the root. In other words, things always tend back to their root, to their original state. So the waters are kind of drawing towards each other. But in the mystical texts, we make it a little bit more specific than that. And we use these terms. They are Aramaic terms. So we say mad stands for dechurin, which means masculine waters. And man stands for mayin nukvin, which means feminine waters. And effectively what we're trying to illustrate over here is that the nature of water is that it will flow. The question is, which direction will it flow? So mayin dechurin, the so-called masculine water, that refers to water as it flows downwards, which is the natural direction that water flows. So be it rain or be it rain or be it the flow of rivers from their source in the mountains till they come down to the ocean level, etc. So mayin dechurin is generally the, so to speak, spiritual term for the principle of flow of spiritual energy downwards. Mayin nukvin, the feminine water means that which ebbs up from under the earth, that which wells up from underground. And that represents the flow from us towards Hashem. So that will also play a big role in our conversation over here in this mimer about the flow of energy. Obviously, you can immediately start to see a relationship. There's going to be a mad relationship, because ma is a higher level and mad is the flow of energy from a higher level. And there'll be a man relationship, because ban represents a lower manifestation and experience of godliness, and man is that push to try and lift yourself up from that space to connect to God. So, Jeff, just to your question, is ban related to the word banayich, right? Like we say every day in our davening. There's a pasuk that says, "B'chol banayich limudei Hashem v'rav shalom banayich." Immediately the Gemara says there's two ways to read that. You could read it as banayich, which means your children, or you could read it as bonayich, which means those who build the world. That second interpretation, those who build the world, which the Gemara is actually referring to Torah scholars who build the world and sustain the world through their Torah learning, that is very strongly related to the principle of ban. Ban is like bolstering the world, strengthening the world through our efforts, as opposed to ma, which is the gift that Hashem may sometimes give into his world. So that was a good observation, because it has definitely a connection. Okay, so those are the terms that we're going to need to know in order to really navigate our way through this particular conversation, right? Okay, so that's what we've got to look through. Very interesting point about ban. Very interesting point that ban is double the value of 26. Okay, interesting point. And perhaps during the course of our conversation, we'll actually get an insight into why that might be. Now, the tension between these two realities, the ma reality and the ban reality, between the mad reality and the man reality, is a consistent tension. Because if you think about it, it's the tension between where is the priority, or what exactly makes the world run. Is the world all about Hashem's input, or is the world all about our efforts? So that tension becomes a very interesting part of the ongoing conversation as to how are we supposed to understand the world? Are we supposed to understand it as it's for Hashem to make change and to do miracles? Or are we to understand it as it's for us to facilitate change and to invest effort? So that's a big part of this conversation, and that's why this mimer is about the dual spiritual reality of our world. Because, as is often the case, it's not a black or white answer. It's not just this is correct and that isn't. And so that's what we're going to discover through the course of our conversation. We're going to analyze these two realities, and the way that they're going to play out is in the space of two human characters and two dimensions of what we call the 10 sephiros. So let's first start with the sephiros, and then we'll talk about the two characters. So we know that Hashem created the world using 10 sephiros, 10 different energies, and there's a template that he created, and everything has to exist within that template. The template itself is primarily a template of energies in God's space, and then there is energy that God, so to speak, generates outside of his space in order to create. So the energies within God's space, we call those, firstly, generically, we call them sephiros, but more specifically, we identify 6 of them as what is called Zeir Anpin. I'm not going to get caught up in the terminology about Zeir Anpin at this point, but suffice it to say that that's the internal workings of how Hashem gears himself up to engage with his creation. What is valuable for our conversation is the last of those spheros, because the last of those spheros becomes the bridge. Let's put this into language we can all relate to. Let's say that you have, inside yourself, you have a certain temperament, you have certain characteristics, you have certain feelings, you have certain ideas. It's possible for a person to have great ideas and to have deep sentiment, and nobody knows about it. And that's the mistake that we often make. We think because something is so real and compelling to us, we just assume that everybody else knows how we feel. And that's nonsensical, obviously. So we need a bridge. We need a bridge that allows us to start to shift from how I experience my own sentiment to how I should share it with somebody else. If I don't have that bridge, then I will never share with anybody else. Not only will I never share, I'll never enter the headspace to even identify the possibility of somebody else. You get people like that. They live in their own heads. They're completely oblivious to the fact that there are other people around. They're completely oblivious to the fact that people are not mind readers. They're completely oblivious to the possibility that there are other opinions besides their own. These people don't get very far in life because they make too many assumptions and nobody's on the same page as them, and slowly but surely people drift away from them. Then you get those people who are brilliant at making the bridge. They are so good at knowing how to take what's going on internally and to translate it into terms that could be shared with somebody else, that they're often and successfully in touch with other people, informing other people, inspiring other people, connecting with other people. Those are the people we like in our lives. They get us. They speak to us. They don't have expectations of us. We call that Yesoid. Yesoid is that critical element that allows a person the potential to bridge themselves with somebody else. So in the same way as we identify that there's a trait inside the human being called chesed. What's chesed? That you feel kind. And that's part of who you are. I feel like I'm a kind person. Does that mean that I'll actually share kindness with other people? Not necessarily. That chesed will need yesoid. It will need a bridge. It will need some kind of transportation to take it from the theoretical chesed to the applicable goodness that you're going to share with somebody else. So yesoid is a very important part of mad. What's mad? Mad is the flow of energy from the one who is developed, from the one who is at a high level, from the one who is from the one who is lofty, to be able to share with the one who is lower or less qualified or less capable. So if the reality did not have Yesoid, it would never be able to share anything with anybody else. Now, you know what happens once you share? Once you share, it's no longer yours. That's what happens. People get frustrated because they say, you took what I said out of context. Yes, because once you've said it, it's no longer yours. And that's why you have to be so careful how you say something, not to allow the possibility that somebody could distort what you've said. Because once you've given it away, once you have shared, you can't unshare. Once you've told somebody how you feel, if subsequently you discover that they didn't really give you the empathy you were looking for, you can't take it back. You have now shared it. That's the reality. So that crossover, that reality, that spiritual space where something actually lives independently of you, that is called Malchus. So in Hashem's terms, if we're going to speak about the element called Ma, which is how Hashem showers the world with his perspective and insight and energy, that would still be in the Yesoid space. He is bridging himself to our world. But when you look at the Ban reality, Ban is how the world actually operates and how we sort of struggle our way through the world trying to find meaning and to elevate things to a healthy space, then we'd be living in a reality called Malchus, where Hashem has essentially relinquished absolute control and allowed us the opportunity to also have input. So the tension and the dynamic of all of existence is about the tension between Yesoid and Malchus. How much is the teacher bridging? How much does the teacher allow the student to rise? If as a teacher you're constantly spoon feeding, that's Yesoid, I'm always reaching over the bridge, always giving, always mayin dechurin, the masculine water, always rain. If I'm always spoon feeding, the student can never learn skills of their own. So I'll stifle the Malchus. On the other hand, if I pull back completely and say, hey, you're adults now, you could do this all on your own, and I don't occasionally recreate that bridge, and I don't occasionally feed, well, then the person may run out of steam, or they may lose their way, or they may just simply dry up and shrivel up and not have any inspiration. So there's a tension between these realities, between Ma and Ban, between Mayin Dechurin and Mayin Nukvin, between Yesoid and Malchus, and that's almost a summary of all of the dynamics of how this world of ours works. Now, it's often difficult for us to relate to principles as they are in the abstract. So because of that, the Torah tells us stories. And the objective of those stories is, read the story. You'll find the story easy to relate to. You'll be able to relate to the characters in the story. Maybe you'll resonate with certain things about those characters in the story. And because it's more personal when you learn it in a story, it will help you to take abstract concepts and make them a lot more realistic to you. So we're at the time in the annual Parsha reading where we're reading stories. And the stories that we read, you have a choice. You could read those stories at a highly superficial level and say, these were interesting people and they went through interesting experiences in their lives. And maybe we might even extract some basic lessons, lessons like it might not be a good idea to put your wife in a box and try to smuggle her across the border into Egypt, those kinds of lessons. But the truth is, we're supposed to be looking for so much more than that. The Torah is so much deeper and broader than that. So we're looking for so much more. So what are these stories about? What do these characters represent? And every one of these stories is told to us specifically to highlight a particular principle of spirituality. The story we're going to focus on in this particular conversation is going to be the story of Yosef and Yehuda, the grand showdown between two brothers at a moment in their life when they didn't even realize that they were faced, or at least one of them didn't realize he was face to face with his brother. It's a very interesting story. It's a very dramatic story. And everything within that story is designed to convey this tension that we're describing now, because we have to ask ourselves one big question about that story. Here's the story. The brothers don't like Yosef. And because they have a hard time with him and they think he has all these delusions of grandeur and he claims that he's one day going to rule all over them, whatever it is whatever their issue was. So initially they thought they would kill him, then they backed down and they decided they were going to sell him instead as a slave, and he lands up in Egypt. Now in the brothers' minds, that's the end of the story. They've probably lost him forever. When they see the trauma that their father goes through and they recognize that maybe it wasn't the best thing, that's when they start to have regrets and they decide that if there's any way possibly that they could find their brother and bring him back, they'll do so. Great rescue mission in Egypt. So when there's a famine and they have to go down to Egypt in order to get food, they use that as an opportunity to see if it is possible to track down their lost brother Joseph. Of course, they don't even know where to begin, and they don't even know who they should be looking for because it's decades down the line, and obviously he no longer looks like a 17-year-old when they last saw him. He's now going to be a mature adult. Joseph, on the other hand, at this point is now the viceroy of Egypt. He's essentially the most powerful man in the most powerful country in the world at that time. And he does recognize his brothers. He knows exactly who they are. And so starts this very interesting experience of him testing their loyalties to each other, most importantly, their loyalty to the youngest brother, Binyamin, who is his only maternal sibling. So that's very valuable to him. And it becomes this intriguing, this drama that unfolds between them. Eventually, the drama hits its apex when Joseph says, I will not give you any more food unless you bring this baby brother that you keep talking about to Egypt, which they do. And so they eventually bring Binyamin down. And Binyamin also is none the wiser. He doesn't know that he's face to face with Joseph, but Joseph gives him a lot of attention. He really spoils him more than the other brothers. And then, in a twist, right at the end, what does Joseph do? He hides his special goblet in Binyamin's sack, and he uses that as an excuse to have them all arrested and brought back to the palace. And then he accuses them of this most terrible crime, trying to steal from the ruler of Egypt. And he says Binyamin is going to be thrown into prison. That brings us to the part of the story we're going to analyze. Because out of all the brothers, Yehuda, brother number 4, he was the one who took personal responsibility that he was going to bring Binyamin back hale and healthy. So it's now his personal responsibility to do everything in his power to make sure that Binyamin does not go to prison. And so there's this confrontation between Yosef and Yehuda. Yehuda goes towards Yosef and he confronts him. Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Yehuda approaches, and the Gemara says, what does the word Vayigash mean? Sometimes you find that Vayigash means preparing for war. Other times you find that Vayigash means that you're preparing to try and compromise. So what exactly was going on over here? The implication, according to most commentaries, is he was ready for war. Vayigash Elav Yehuda. Yehuda approaches Yosef, and he tries to negotiate on behalf of Binyamin. And it's only after that moment, that's when Yosef breaks down. That's when Yosef asks the Egyptians to leave so they can reveal his identity to his brothers, and then everything is reconciled. So this is a really important moment, this moment of trying to, one second. So it's this moment of trying to be able to reconcile or trying to sort things out with Yosef. That is the pivot of everything that we're going to learn, because Yosef and Yehuda represent two very different leadership styles. They were both leaders. Yosef was a leader in Egypt and subsequently had power over his brothers exactly as he had dreamed. And Yehuda was the progenitor of the kings of Israel. So that's, so to speak, the ultimate Jewish leadership. And throughout our history, we're going to see that there are times when Yehuda's descendants are the Jewish leaders, and there are other times when Yosef's descendants are the Jewish leaders. So that's fascinating, and we have to analyze that as well. So the whole story of Yehuda confronting Yosef begs one question. Who holds the power in that story? It's obvious, right? Obviously, Yosef holds the power. He's the second to the king. He sits on the throne. He can make life and death decisions. He could choose whether to supply food or to withhold food. He could decide if he wants to prosecute or even execute the brothers. It's all in his right. He has all the power, which only makes it that much more intriguing that Yehuda has the inner power to stand up to him. And that's why it begs the question, who has the real power? Yosef has power because he sits on a throne, and Yehuda has power because he digs deep within himself and he finds the power to speak, as the expression goes, to speak truth to power. So there's the tension again. Where is the real power? Is the real power in the man on the throne, or is the real power in the man on the ground? And we'll use this as a template to understand, is the real power in the force of ma, or is the real power in the force of ban? Is the real greatness of life Yesoid, or is the real greatness Malchus? Now, right now, that's a very theoretical question. And as we unpack this, we'll have to associate both Yesoid and Malchus, or for that matter, Ma and Ban, to our experiences in our Jewish practice. And this will really come to one core question. What is the core of Judaism? Is the core of Judaism Yosef, or is the core of Judaism Yehuda? Is the core of Judaism inspiration, or is the core of Judaism perspiration? Is the core of Judaism what comes from on high, or is the core of Judaism whatever we're able to develop down here through our hackneyed human efforts? That's what we're going to explore during the course of this mimer. There are some technical moments where the language is a little bit dense, but by and large, you'll see it's an absolutely fascinating discussion on this particular topic.